Savesim Padamang Pavaimangalam.
Okay, we're live.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming, joining us. Welcome also to the people watching on YouTube. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Dicky Shah, and this is my fourth year doing a talk during Parushan. This year, the topic is women and salvation in Jainism. It was actually suggested to me by my dad, and I thought, given the current social climate that we're in, I thought, fairly appropriate topic. The talk really is going to delve into the main point of debate between Svetambar and Digambar regarding the ability for a woman to gain moksha, Stri moksha. But I wanted to talk about that within a broader historical and cultural context, because I think when we talk about the history behind the societies in which these debates were created, it gives us a better understanding and a better perception, perspective. So let's start with history. Women throughout history have really gotten the short end of the stick. I think we can all probably agree on that. At least since the agricultural revolution more than 10,000 years ago, they have been relegated an inferior role in society, inferior to their male counterparts. Throughout history, social norms, things that are considered normal in any given society, have generally been created by an elite, privileged, ruling, and usually literate class of people. These social norms are a construct that represents a scaffolding, if you will, to support an artificial hierarchy. The reason for the hierarchy is to ensure that the elite class maintains their elite status. They accomplish this by systematic discrimination. They create discriminatory laws. They use discriminatory practices. They create discriminatory myths that are ultimately inextricably woven into the religions of those societies. When you look at this as a social context, in the greater social context, you see that the effectiveness, the brutal effectiveness of this strategy essentially allows a ruling class, a small ruling class, to maintain their status. And it's so effective that what was once an artificial construct over time becomes accepted as the natural order. And it's not questioned anymore. Take, for example, fair skin and beauty. There are still people around the world, not just in India, who associate fairness with beauty. Now, there's nothing biologically or objectively more attractive about fair skin over darker complexion. And yet, this is something that is just considered acceptable in many societies, even today. So the theory behind this, perhaps, is that when a fairer-skinned conquering people came into the Indian subcontinent, displacing an indigenous population that had a darker skin, and established this artificial hierarchy in which they maintained their elite status, they discriminated against the darker complexioned people. And this then, over years, thousands of years, created this notion that fair skin is more attractive. Ultimately, it's just a preference, right? But the preference has been heavily influenced by these social constructs. Yeah, if you don't mind waiting till the end. So whether it's casteism in India, racism in the United States, economic discrimination around the world, it's all maintained through the creation of myth, through the help of religion, and through these social norms that are really created. And even when the suppressed classes rise up in revolt and overthrow their oppressors, it seems that there's a natural tendency to develop another hierarchy within that new society. This is a line from Animal Farm by George Orwell, written and published towards the end of World War II, and it was basically a warning against the rise of fascism in the Soviet Union, which started as communism. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And that right there, in a nutshell, is what happens to societies. So throughout the different communities and cultures and societies, you have varying forms of discrimination. But interestingly, and really we don't know why this is, but sexism, or this discrimination against you based on your gender, seems almost universal in almost every culture and every society throughout history. Even cultures that have no connection with each other, no contact, still you see women always getting placed in an inferior role. And we really don't know why that is. Some argue it's maybe because they're physically weaker. On average, that may be true, but why would that translate into being a subjugated class of the population? There are countless examples where physically stronger segments of the population are subjugated by weaker, by a weaker segment. Take, for example, African slaves in the colonial times of the United States. These African slaves had more resistance to the diseases that were killing Europeans in the United States, like malaria and yellow fever. Yet they were the subjugated segment of the population. So it can't be just strength. And there's a bunch of different theories, but none of them really hold water. And so we really don't know why this is. But because of this, fewer resources throughout history were dedicated to women's health and education. They had fewer economic opportunities, and as a result of this, they had less political power. So they weren't in a position where they could influence their own rights. They're underrepresented, they're disenfranchised, and ultimately they are completely dependent on their male counterparts. First their fathers, then their husbands. In many communities, they were actually considered property of the male person in the family. And here we see the difference, right? Biologically, there is not really a case to be made that women are inferior to men. But gender, which is a completely made-up social construct, and which changes throughout history and changes from one community to another, gender is what influences the notion of superiority and inferiority. And when we look at the arguments used to justify throughout history this discrimination, we run into this interesting circular argument. You take one segment of society, in this case women, and you prohibit them in participating from an activity that would ordinarily be associated with skill, capacity, intelligence, that sort of thing. And then you use the fact that there aren't that many women in that role, in those activities, as the proof that they're not good at those things, right? Women can't become engineers. They're no good at engineers. Just look, there's not that many women engineers. That's your proof. So discourage them from going into that. The systematic suppression of women obviously has gone on for thousands of years. And even in modern society, it took a world war before women started winning the right to vote. Historian Leslie Hume says, the women's contribution to the war effort challenged the notion of women's physical and mental inferiority and made it more difficult to maintain that women were, both by constitution and temperament, unfit to vote. This is 1920, right? This is post-World War I, less than 100 years ago. Women Most of the men were off fighting the war, so someone had to be the police officers and fight fires and work in the factories, and women took on that role. And it was only after that that they gained the right to vote. And since then, it's been fairly slow progress, right? The Equal Rights Amendment, a constitutional amendment that protects your rights regardless of your gender, still has not passed. Still has not had enough state legislatures ratify it. And even today, women are underrepresented in fields, many fields, science, technology fields, engineering. And they face lower salaries even in fields where their representation is improved, like medicine. They still make less than men, even in that field. So what does this have to do with Jainism? Well, Indian history obviously is not immune from the same type of cultural misogyny and gynophobia. It was very prevalent in India last millennium BC, which also saw the rise of Brahmanism and the Shraman movements, these heterodox movements of which Jainism was one. And throughout India's history, this patriarchal society was reinforced by the later Islamic conquests and by the British Raj, all communities where women were considered inferior and subjugated. Jainism, of course, is one of these Shraman movements, and it's interesting because the rise of Jainism during this period really reflected a counteraction to the Brahmanical traditions, certainly of animal sacrifice and reliance on the Vedic scriptures. But most interestingly, and perhaps most importantly, it was a reaction against casteism, the inequalities that were inherent in the Brahmanical casteism. Brahmins believed that if you are born into a low caste, it was because of something you did in a previous life, and there is no hope for you in this life. Your only hope is in the next life. So you live your life in the caste in which you were born. Jainism and Buddhism said no, everyone, almost everyone, no matter which caste you're in, has the same opportunity to gain moksha. All you have to do is lead an ascetic life, follow the right path, and you, regardless of your caste, can attain moksha. But interestingly, this didn't seem to extend to women even during this period, in some cases. So, history of Jainism. Real quick review. Mahavir Bhagwan, the last Tirthankar, was thought to live between 599 and 527 BCE. He taught the fivefold restraint, Panch Mahavrat. His teachings were composed by his Ganadhars, his disciples, into the 12 Angs. He did not wear clothing. His predecessor was Parshvanath Bhagwan, who lived probably 200 or so years before him, and his followers did wear clothing. But what he promoted was this concept of anekantvat, that regardless of your viewpoints, there can be multiple valid perspectives. There's an interesting discourse between Kesi, who's a disciple of Parshvanath, and Gautam Swami in and forgive me for the pronunciation, Uttaradhyayan Sutra, which is granted it's accepted only by the Svetambar sect. But in there is they discuss the differences between the teachings of Parshvanath Bhagwan and Mahavir Bhagwan. And they come to the conclusion that both are equally valid perspectives. Oh no, you can, that's fine. So people had differing points of view, but they all seemed to get along. Until 300 BCE. And this is a great schism, right, between the Digambar and Svetambar sects. So what happened here? Acharya Bhadrabahu is the last leader of the unified Mendicant order. He's considered to be, by both sects, the last Shrut Kevali, the last person who knew all of Mahavir Bhagwan's teachings. author of the Kalpa Sutra for Svetambar's Sagaram, he predicted a famine was coming in the north part of India where Jainism flourished. Now, this may have been a literal famine, or it could have been a figurative famine, a famine of knowledge. But in order to preserve the learnings, the teachings of Mahavir Bhagwan, he left with a group of followers and went south to Karnataka. He left his disciple Stulabhadra in charge in the north. Well, over the years, Stulabhadra saw that, sure enough, the doctrine was fragmenting and beginning to fade. And so he convened the Patliputra Council to gather all the fragments of the doctrine, put it together in a revised canon. He does this, and the followers who went down south, they faithfully preserve their teachings, the original teachings. I give the example of when you're an immigrant. If you're ever an immigrant, you go to a new country, you become so afraid that you're going to lose touch with your culture that you try extremely hard to preserve your culture and to preserve your teachings. And you become even more strict than the people in your homeland. Right? If you ever gone, if you ever, sometimes if you've come here from India and you go back to India after years, you tend to think that you feel more faithfully preserving your culture than the people that you left. Right? And this is probably what happened here. And so they come back, and people have moved on. In the north, where Jainism was flourishing, the culture, the traditions all evolved. And they come back and they see the monks, or some of them are wearing clothing. There's this new canon that they never had a hand in creating. And so they reject all of this. And this is where the split starts. But at first, it's not a huge rift, I don't believe. But over the centuries, rather than mending the rift seemed to grow further and further apart. So the debate really is about these women. Can a female mendicant, a Jain mendicant, can she achieve moksha in her current female body? Interestingly, in the earliest scriptures, there's really no debate. There's really no discussion of whether or not, women can attain moksha or not. It's just not even discussed. Then in around 2nd century, there's a rise of a third sect of Jainism, now extinct, called the Yapanya. They believed in the Svetambar scripture, the doctrine from Patliputra. They practiced nudity when they were in the forest, but when they came into populated areas, they would wear a single piece of cloth. Ek falak. And most interestingly and importantly, they believed that women could achieve moksha. Well, in 150 CE, Acharya Kundakunda wrote or presented the Suttapauda. This is the earliest written assertion and reasoning. This is part of the debate. This is the earliest debate that souls cannot attain moksha in the female body, and it perhaps was in reaction to the contemporaneous rise of the Yapanya sect. And so this is where the debate really starts. Okay, this is hundreds of years after Mahavir Bhagwan. So what Kunda said is this. A nun is called Aryaka. She wears a single piece of cloth. In the teaching of the Jinnah, a person does not attain moksha if one wears clothes. Nudity is the path leading to moksha. All others are wrong paths. Women, he adds, have no purity of mind. They are by nature fickle-minded. They have monthly menstruation. Therefore, there is no meditation free from anxiety. This here is the Digambar perspective. And since then, the debate continued for nearly 2,000 years. And in the scriptures, both by Shwetambar scholars and Digambar scholars, they're written in a point-counterpoint style. And so I'm going to use that style a little bit in this presentation. Keep in mind the context. Okay, we talked about the contextual history of gender discrimination. All of these commentaries were written by men and probably for men, because literacy amongst women was very poor. They used tools, scriptural authority, empirical observation, logical reasoning, and in some cases, they interpreted the language, the original language, and they used this to support their positions. Again, created in a very patriarchal society. So, given this, there are some things that we need to understand before we go into the debate. Both sects accepted as natural order, as fact, that women were inferior to men. That was not the debate. Svetlanberg just said that that inferiority is no obstacle to attaining moksha. Some also believe that the debate around Stri Moksha is a metaphorical or symbolic debate in the greater struggle over sectarian validity. Each sect wants to say this is the correct path, and they use this as a tool. So Svetlanberg and Digambar, their basic difference is whether or not you can be clothed as a monk. Right. Originally, the Svetlanberg position was not so strong. They said, well, if you want to wear clothing, you can. If you don't, it's fine. They're both okay. Digambars, of course, said, no, you can't wear clothing. But over time, as that rift widened, clothing optional became nudity prohibited. You have to wear clothing. Why? Because we are not in the enlightened age of Mahavir Bhagavan. We are in a decayed age. And in this age, you can't go around naked. Prohibited. So the debate over Stri Moksha really stems from this. And then it branches out into four main points of contention, which we'll go into. In the beginning, usually the way the debate goes, the Digambar position comes first. They say there is no evidence that women may attain moksha. Flat statement. There's nothing in the scriptures that say explicitly women may attain moksha. Svetlanberg says, well, we know what the scriptures say about what it takes to attain moksha, right? You have to have the three jewels. What are the three jewels? Samyak darshan, gnan, charitrani, moksha, right? This is from the Tattvartha Sutra. So the first line, and it encapsulates really all of Jainism's doctrine. The enlightened worldview, the enlightened knowledge, and enlightened conduct, that is the path to liberation. And there's nowhere that says that women can't attain those three jewels. But the Digambar says, it's true, they can attain those jewels, but they cannot perfect those jewels. Especially because they can't give up clothing. Remember, there's no debate about whether women can go naked or not. Both sects say, no, absolutely not. Women are forbidden to go nude. So the Digambar says that, well, in that case, while they may have enlightened conduct, they can't conduct themselves perfectly because they have to wear clothing. And that is a requirement for moksha that they can't achieve. The first component of the debate, it really talks about the woman's innate ability in her female form to attain moksha. What is there? Is there an obstacle? Both sects agree with this. Women cannot be born into the seventh hell, Mahatma Prabha, right? Here's our Trilok, right? This is where humans live. These are the seven hells. These are the heavens. Here's the Siddhasala at the top. This hell is the pitch darkness hell. And the scriptures say that women are not able to do anything so evil that their next life they'll end up in the worst hell. The Digambar says that there needs to be a cosmic balance. if a woman can't go to the lowest hell, then the balance demands that they cannot go to the highest heaven. The idea here is that women need, or any soul, needs absolute concentration to perform heinous evil and also pure good. And because they don't have the ability to perform that pure evil act, because they lack that concentration and that ability, they similarly don't have the strength of concentration to perform suklatyan. And without that supreme concentration, they cannot rise to the highest levels, including moksha. Prabhachanda, who was a Digambar Acharya, writes, "The excellence of knowledge and so forth required for moksha is not found in women, because such excellence and so forth must have absolute perfection. Just as women lack the ultimate extreme of demerit, which is the immediate cause of rebirth in the seventh hell, they therefore also lack the absolute perfection required for attaining moksha." The Sweptambar counter-argument is that there is nothing in the scriptures and no logical connection, vyapti, between the inability to fall into the worst hell and the inability to attain moksha. Okay? There's no logical connection. One doesn't cause the other. There's nothing in the scriptures that say one causes the other. And it's not invariably related. The Digambar says it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be cause and effect. There's an association. They call it the indicator-indicated association, and they use, as an example, the rising of constellations. If one constellation rises, you can infer that the other constellation will rise after it. Okay? One doesn't cause the other. But, you can infer it. So the Svetambar counter that, and they use scriptural authority. They say that the state of the liberated soul in the Tattvartha Sutra, it says that it is considered through 12 gateways of an investigation: place, time, realm of birth, forward conduct, 12 of them. And included in that list is gender. And what this means is that these are the categories of a liberated soul. So they say, logically, if gender, which in the Sanskrit is ling, is a category of liberated souls, then surely there has to be at least two types, right? If you're going to make a category, you have to have at least two types, otherwise what's the point of having a category? So, both men and women, at least, must be amongst the liberated souls. Well, Digambar, interestingly, takes this position. Ling is not referring to your biological sex. It is referring to your psychological libido, or vid. Biological males and females can have either male or female libidos. Right? What does this mean? Well, it means that a male may have the libido of a female. This is what we would term homosexual. And similarly, females can have male libido. So, to the Digambar, this categorization, ling, in the Tattvartha Sutra and in the doctrine, refers to homosexual men and heterosexual men. Right? Both men, but their libido is different, and that's the category. That's what it's really talking about. And of course, ultimately, all sexual desires are annihilated on the path to purification, so there's no difference in the end. Svetambar counters this and says, well, if a man who was trived, right, has the libido of a woman, or homosexual, is allowed to attain moksha, then why not a woman who is trived, who would be heterosexual? And on that same line, why deny a woman moksha if she were pumbed, or homosexual? If such a contrasting libido is okay for a man to attain moksha. And at this point, Digambar's argument turns to biology and anatomy. What they say is that the female body, the body itself, is what prevents the attainment of moksha. Remember that the argument here is that females are inherently unable, in their female body to attain moksha. So this is actually quite unique to Jainism. Now, like we talked about before, it's quite common belief that women were the inferior sex, weaker, and unable to survive the rigors of austerities required. And this is true in lots of religions. But what's unique in Jainism is a focus on biology and anatomy and how it relates to ahimsa. So let's talk about what the context of this debate here. Both Svetambar and Digambar believe that being born a woman is a result of the wrong worldview. Okay? Mityatva. Once a soul attains samyaktva, the enlightened worldview, it cannot be reborn as a woman. Okay? Both of them agree with that. Now, samyaktva may be attained later in the life of the woman, but she's not born with it. They also believe, both sects, that the female body is the abode of numerous minute forms of life. In various parts of the anatomy, these creatures exist. And during menstruation, countless numbers of these creatures are destroyed. This is a common belief. So they say, samyaktva cannot be perfected. You can attain it, you can start it, but it cannot be perfected in the female body because of biology and anatomy. Simply bathing and moving, and in the extreme, as I mentioned, menstruation constantly destroys these life forms that live on the female body. All right? This results in constant anxiety. You're worried that you're creating so much harm. And because of that anxiety, you can't have the mental calmness required during meditation to perfect your right worldview. The Svetambar argument is that you can perfect it in the female body because females can overcome these obstacles. They're not saying that they don't have them. They also agree that, yes, you're destroying life by moving and by your menstruation, but you can overcome those obstacles and still get to moksha. Further, Svetambars even believe that samyaktva, at least in one case, a female was born with samyaktva. Now this is a headless Tirthankar statue, but you can clearly see that this is a female form. And this is believed to be representation of Malinath Bhagwan. So what's the story of Malinath Bhagwan? She was the one female Tirthankar according to Svetambars. The story goes that King Mahabala became a monk with 7 of his friends. He took a vow to undertake, all of them are going to undertake the same number of fasts. But deceitfully, he did more fasts than his friends. Now, everything else he did was perfect. And so he became enlightened, and he had samyaktva. But because of the deceit, he was reborn in a female form, in the very life that he became a Tirthankar. And since all Tirthankar Bhagwans are born with samyaktva, then here's a case where a female has samyaktva. And this, of course, is the Svetambar tradition. Interestingly, it also shows that being born a female is a result of sin. The next component of the debate is one that we touched upon before. Women cannot be nude. Again, I told you that Svetambar and Digambar do not debate this point. They both agree women cannot be nude. The holy conduct of women is insufficient to attain moksha, because that conduct is dependent upon possessions, i.e. clothing, as in the case of householders who are also barred from attaining moksha because of their property and other possessions. Okay. This is, again, the Digambar position. Because you have a possession, and you have to have the possession because you can't be nude, you're incapable of truly perfecting Aparigra. The Svetambar position is that possession means attachment. If you are not attached to your clothing, then it doesn't count as a possession. They give the example of the nude monk meditating in a forest. If someone were to come up and throw clothing on that monk, surely the Digambar would not say that this monk has broken his vow of aparigra because now there's clothing on him. Well, the Digambar takes that example and says, yes, that monk, when he stands up, will simply discard the clothing and go about his business. And that shows that that monk is not attached to the clothing. Whereas a female nun, if she lost her clothing, she would deliberately pick up the clothing and wear it. And that shows that she's not detached. So to this, the Svetambar argues that picking up the clothes for a female nun is no different than picking up the whisk broom for a male monk. The whisk broom is used to reduce himsa, reduce harm, right? Sweeping away the insects and so forth. And it enhances your ability to be spiritual and to follow the path. So it's no different for a female nun who needs the clothing to perfect her spirituality. The Svetambar author, Meghavijay, wrote in Yukti Prabhupada the Digambar position. Women would not be able to attain moksha since the wearing of clothes generates lice and their eggs, as well as beings with three sense faculties, touch, taste, and smell. Harm would come to those beings with each step by the acts of washing the clothes or placing them down somewhere. So it follows from this that the Mahavrats of the nuns are not real Mahavrats, but are so designated only as a symbolic of their status. Okay? They can't really be true aparigra. They can't follow it truly because of this. We talked about the broom. Having clothing also makes you dependent on the lay community, which in turn results in more himsa. The Svetambar position basically is that the himsa that you are causing is just outweighed by the spiritual advantage that you give a woman when she wears clothing to help her on her path. And the ultimate question then is that, are the two paths equivalent? Here's a path where you don't have to wear clothing, so it's perhaps a more pure form of aparigra, and here's a path where you do need to depend on clothing. So can these two disparate paths be equivalent, and can they lead to the same moksha? And of course, Svetambar says yes, but the Digambar says no. The third point of contention. Now we move from scriptures and logic to empiric observation. Again, this is not debated. Women are inferior in their ability to debate. Now, originally, nuns were probably involved in debate and scholarly pursuits during Mahavir Bhagwan's time. But over the years, they started to be pushed out of those arenas. Their ability to pursue debate and to learn and to read the doctrine diminished over time. And eventually they were really only permitted to study rudimentary texts on conduct. So they were not allowed to study the more philosophical doctrines. And so they really had less ability to participate in these debates because of that. Again, here's another verse from the Yukti Prabodha. Women are vain, full of pride, of fickle senses, and weak in body and mind. They should be taught only the minor texts and not the purvas. Okay. Well, the other thing that women were not thought able to do is to conjure up supernatural deities to help them in the debates. And this was a part of debating in ancient Jainism. And because they were women, they felt that they didn't have that power, that supernatural ability. So women's lack of the Svetambar position then says that, well, just because they can't debate, that doesn't mean they can't attain moksha. There's no connection there. In fact, there's many incidences of Mukha Kevalins souls who never spoke a word and still attain moksha, let alone debate. The Digambar position is interesting. They kind of flip the logic backwards. And they say that the ability to debate is not from learning the scriptures. It's not from studying. The ability to debate comes from observing strict austerities. They already believe that women cannot practice those austerities because they're women. And that is why they can't debate. So their lack of ability of debating is actually proof that they cannot observe the austerities as strictly as men. So they flipped it around in this logic. And it's a circular logic, right? You shouldn't debate. You can't debate because you can't follow the strict austerities. And the fact that we don't see any females, mendicants debating is just proof that you can't. It's a circular argument. We've heard this before. The last point of contention stems from this. Again, empirical observation. Women occupy inferior positions in society and within the mendicant order itself. Even in the Svetambara tradition, nuns are not equal to monks in most regards, only in their ability to attain moksha. Otherwise, this is the feeling. This is even for Svetambara nuns. Even if a nun is ordained for 100 years, she must pay homage to a young monk, even if that monk, male monk, has been ordained that very day by going forth to meet him and by greeting him in reverence. A female nun, no matter how senior she is, can be admonished by a monk. And the female nun can confess to a monk, but the reverse is prohibited. Okay? A nun may not admonish a monk and cannot receive a monk's confession. So it's only in the ability to attain moksha, or even in the Svetambara tradition, where nuns equal to monks. So the Digambars say that nuns are inferior in the Svetambara sect. That proves that they are inferior to men, and because of that inferior status, they have an inferior ability to perform Sukla Dhyan, which we already talked about. The Svetambars use the same argument that there is no logical connection between the ability to, your social status, or even the status within the mendicant order, and the ability to attain moksha. They give the example of the teacher greeting a pupil. The teacher here is the monk. A teacher, even if the monk or the teacher doesn't greet the pupil with reverence, which teachers sometimes don't, the pupil still has an equal ability to attain moksha. So there's no logical connection. Digambars give more examples of society and of spiritual inferiority. The man is the master of the household in these societies. Princes can become kings, but princesses are forbidden to take over inheriting the throne or take over kingdoms. Even in religious myth, there have never been females born as Chakravartins or universal kings, considered the highest rebirth for a human. Or even an Indra, king of gods. It's never happened. And this social inferiority, they believe, translates into spiritual inferiority. And so this is the main debate between Svetambars and Digambars. Okay. But what about the non-Jain traditions? What about in Brahmanism? Well, in Brahmanism, there are no female mendicant orders. Marriage is mandatory for all women. And if a woman finds herself a widow, she may lead the life of a nun, but she can't leave the household. So she is prohibited from joining an actual mendicant order. And no matter how austere she is, the highest rebirth she can attain is in heaven. The first mention of women and the ability to attain moksha comes in the Bhagavad Gita. And in there, the women are categorized with the lowest castes in their ability to attain moksha. And it's still unclear whether it means that they would attain moksha within that female body and that life, or in a future incarnation as a man. What about Buddhism? Buddhism is another Shraman tradition. And it's not as, you think it's not as problematic because nudity was actually prohibited by Buddha Bhagwan. There's a story in Buddhist tradition that says Buddha Bhagwan's aunt, Mahaprajapati Gautami, asked to ordain a group of nuns, a group of women who wanted to become a mendicant order. The Buddha Bhagwan rejected the request 3 times before finally reluctantly approving it at the end of his life. And even at that time, when he said okay, he said, had I not done this, my dharma would last 1,000 years. Because I've done this, it's only going to last half as long. And again, in Buddhism, nuns, even though there were nuns, were not equal to their male counterparts. A nun, even if 100 years old, by ordination must pay respect to a monk, even if he has been ordained just the day before. This looks familiar. This is from the Vinaya Pitaka from first millennium. There's more. In the Jataka tales that recount 547 past lives of Buddha Bhagwan, all of those lives, even the ones where he's reborn as an animal, he's a male. Many traditions in Buddhism say Buddha cannot be born a woman. Nirvana is only attainable by becoming a Buddha Bhagwan. So you effectively are ruling out the ability for women to attain Nirvana. So that's the talk. I have just a few final thoughts, which are really just questions. You can think about it. I think about them. Is this debate relevant today? You know, we're in the Kali Yuga age, which by our teachings say that moksha is not available to men or women. So what's the point of the debate? And what about the population of nuns and monks in the various traditions, sects? Does it reflect their attitudes towards women, towards equality of women, or is it more of the historical debate that we've talked about? Svetambars have about 2,500 sadhus and more than double the amount of sattvis. In the Digambar tradition, there are very few munis, but there are even fewer aryakas, or their equivalent. Most sattvis in the Svetambara tradition come from affluent castes. They're unmarried, they're very young. And this may be because being a sattvi is something that is honorable. It's encouraged and respected. This is, again, respect for women. Buddhism, in Theravada Buddhism, there is no more nuns. So is this debate over three moksha, has that evolved into a discourse about the equality for women? Has this debate that's survived all these thousands of years been because there have been so many women involved in Jainism? It increases their self-esteem and it sustains itself, the mendicant female population. Or does it? The last final thought, I actually wrote it down, and I'm just going to read from this. Because I think that it's sort of interesting to me where we are now. And in this modern society, to have a debate like this, of course, everyone is shocked that, you know, this the attitudes toward women historically, and you know how it's been, and how is there even a debate? I would say that as difficult as it is for those of us in this generation, and for those of us who grew up in modern society, to understand the treatment of women historically in our religion, I think it becomes a little bit easier, and perhaps it is a way of practicing anekanvad if we try to comprehend the cultural and historical context in which this debate and the scriptures were written. And we don't have to accept every viewpoint, But I think that we should strive to understand what lies behind those viewpoints. It's certainly tempting and perhaps the easier path to blindly rail against your opposition. But Jainism would say that this is not the right worldview. At the end of the day, the very existence of a debate over women and salvation, which is really unique to Jainism, might be interpreted as a willingness to explore an opposing viewpoint, even if that viewpoint is ultimately refuted. And I think that is the essence of Anyakatvat. That's it. Any questions?
Yeah, I have one. So you said going back 10,000 years there was agricultural evolution. So what was before agricultural revolution?
So,
hunter-gatherer?
Yeah, exactly.
Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, going back to 70,000 years.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, the agricultural revolution, the first agricultural revolution, 10,000 BCE, was really the Neolithic revolution. So before that, they were just, populations of hunter-gatherers, cavemen. Say again?
Was that time period matriarchal society?
We don't know. We don't know. And we know that once settled human populations started coming into existence, right? If you're going to have a farming culture, you're going to settle into towns and villages and so forth. At that time, it was patriarchal. What happened before that, we don't know.
I have another question. You said that the Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. The Homo sapiens were black and Neanderthals were white. And they were so. And if you think that the Homo sapiens are with less strength and everything, and Neanderthals were having more strength or whatever because they were superior or white or whatever you want to say. But Homo sapiens took over Neanderthals. So that the superiority of white over the black, how does that justify this argument?
So, I think the question is about Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. The current belief is that the Neanderthals died out about 50,000 years ago. So really the populations, from then on are all Homo sapien. So I think that if you're looking at it from a scientific perspective, in 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago, when there were multiple species of humans.
Doesn't go beyond 70,000.
Oh no, humans were around 200,000 years ago. But there were, and so, up until about 50,000 years ago, there were multiple species of humans, of, Homo sapiens. Why one group became the dominant species and the others became extinct, I don't think anyone knows for sure.
More because of the weather conditions.
I don't think there's, to be fair, I don't think there's, there are theories, but I don't think anyone has decided that this is really what happened. Some theories, there's some theory that says that the Homo sapiens evolved into a way of thinking that allowed them to think abstractly and allowed them to, to organize in vast numbers, and that by itself was, enough to overcome the other Homo species where they could only organize and group together in groups of 100, 150.
There was a big difference in the population of the
Yeah, and not just the population, but the ability to organize. So that's one theory. But, this is going back, as I said, more than 40, 50,000 years ago. So, what we see here is really just from about the last 10,000, 12,000 years.
And I have one last question. Could you be kind enough to send me this presentation?
Sure. Yeah.
And link in YouTube presentation afterwards.
Oh, it is there.
If the description bar, just click and then take you to one drive, and you can download.
Oh.
Except the last sentence.
Okay, I'll do that. It's on the JCSC site, right?
JCSC line,
Okay, got
and
it.
video,
Yeah.
and then just look for it.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you, sir.
So, if we think of like the scriptures in our tradition as being those that come from like Gable Yanis versus those that come from non-Gable Yanis, when you went through all the examples of the scriptures saying that women are inferior, maybe I'm wrong, you can correct me, but I think none of them come from Gable. Like all of the mentions of women being inferior are always from imperfect beings that both sects would admit could be totally wrong.
That's absolutely true. So, the point you're bringing up really is the root of, what are our scriptures? If you're a Digambar, you believe that all the scriptures, all the original teachings from Mahavir Bhagwan are lost. Sweatambars believe that the original doctrine is lost, but that fragments and remnants of that tradition, of those teachings, have been compiled into authoritative doctrine. Since that time, and most of the examples that I gave you, those are commentaries. Those are commentaries by Jain scholars, acharyas, and so forth. And you're right. I mean, these are things that are, a scholarly opinion on the doctrine.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason that that's important is because, like, there's nothing, at least if you're a Digambar, actually you can even argue with Digambar because if you don't have the text saying that, then you can't point anything, you can't point anything in the text saying that women are inferior. So I think that it's important to recognize that, like, it's not that either sect in their actual real stuff have said anything about this. Both are, either they've said nothing about it, or you could infer from, how they describe the metaphysics that, that both sects are equal. It's just random people along the way decided to say whatever they said. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're right. I think it's also important to realize that, that can be said about our entire doctrine. It can. Yeah. Yeah. But in particular for Jainism, because we're such an ancient religion, and there were no scriptures. Scriptures implies written doctrine. There was a doctrine, and it was passed on orally. And if you look at the traditional views, the amount of information was enormous. Millions and millions of verses. And all of it was faithfully memorized and passed on from one disciple, from one acharya to the disciple. But, as that sort of perhaps apocryphal story about Bhadrabal suggests, over time people lost the ability to remember everything. And so the doctrine decayed. And the various attempts by acharyas throughout the years were to try to preserve the information.
But to interpret. So, like, the big difference
Yeah.
between, like, the Bible is, like, if you're a believer in Christianity or Judaism,
Right.
and you look to the Old Testament as a believer of one of those religions, you believe that that actually came from God. And
Correct.
that whatever's written in there is whatever, right? But
Correct.
But in our traditions, whatever you believe actually came from the Kebali, whether it did or not,
You don't know?
whatever you believe did, there's nothing in what either side believes, right, that would suggest or document in any way
Yeah.
that one sex is inferior or superior to the other.
True. Although, I will say that some of the very old texts, like the Shatkandagam and some of these other, ancient scripts, were written by people who had knowledge of the original doctrine. They were fragments, they were incomplete, and they had, commentaries. Even the Tattva Sutra has commentaries, that it's always published with. And even the Tattva Sutra was written hundreds of years after Mahavir Bhagwan. But the belief, and this is faith, is that the content came from original doctrine. Now, you're right. Whether you believe it or not, there's really no extant version of the doctrine right? It wasn't written down. It was all, and even when it started getting written down, it was written on, palm leaf. It was written on things that didn't survive. It wasn't engraved in stone. So, we don't have existing examples of what was written. So we believe that the doctrine, was what it was. And the history is that, it was eventually written down by people who did have, knowledge of the doctrine as it was passed down. And if you believe that, that doctrine was faithfully reproduced, then you believe that, this is where our religion comes from. But you're right. I mean, what the commentaries that you saw, some of them very ancient, a couple thousand years old. But I think that it is not surprising to see that in the documents, in our doctrine. It's not surprising. I mean, the world was like that. So why would Jainism or India be different? And it really hasn't been over the thousands of years. So I think, as I mentioned, that this perhaps at one point artificial hierarchy became accepted as the natural order. And none of the debates, even the debates about the stream mode, none of, they all take for granted some things. But you're right. I mean, to answer the original question, our scriptures are really a living creature. It's something that has evolved and grown and changed over time. And part of the reason for that, and part of the beauty of Jainism and what's unique in Jainism, is that it does change. It evolves with time. As time changes, the doctrine changes. And that, again, kind of speaks to anekantvad. You can't be an absolutist in Jainism. You can't. I mean, it's contrary to our central belief. You can be a Orthodox Christian or a Orthodox Muslim and say this is the Word of God and it's immutable. But Jainism doesn't look at that, and I think that's one of the beauties of our scriptures.
I have one more question.
Yeah, let me go ahead.
Again, basically, if clothing was a big deal, right, then none of the monks as a sort of founder should be achieving diamond feet.
Well, that was the. Can everyone hear me? I thought I'd take this off. That was the debate, and the idea here is that the Sethambers believe that